Hi guys, welcome back to the channel and back to this kind of series, I guess. We are just under a week out from the 100 miler. Come to Ashdown Forest in East Sussex, which is one of my kind of favourite places to run, but also to walk. Usually come out here with the dog. We're going to do a little example hill session today. Obviously I'm not going to be absolutely smashing myself into the ground being 6 days away from a 100-mile race, but just get a little bit of blood flow through the legs, and also talk about what the benefit of doing this kind of training is, both uphill sessions and downhill sessions as well, which in my opinion are particularly applicable to ultramarathons and any running where you're going to be working uphill and also downhill. Obviously a week out, nerves are beginning to kick in a little bit. Things over the last month or so have been pretty nuts. We've moved, which was a bit of stress, which we kind of knew was going to happen, and then that's just kind of compounded and getting into the rhythm of life. 30 minutes outside of where we were before, so a little bit of travel with work and things like that. So this race has kind of just snuck up. Done a couple of higher volume weeks leading into this, which is something that I kind of trialed, which was a little bit different. I feel pretty fit off the back of that, but there's still always that, that going into the unknown, that kind of unnerving element of taking on a big race, a big challenge that I'm beginning to feel now. I think that's quite natural. I think that is something which, is one of the reasons that I'm taking on this challenge, is because I'm going into a realm of endurance that I've never experienced before. So as much as I am, kind of a little bit unnerved by it, it's what I kind of wanted and expected. So I've kind of got to just lean into that and almost use it as a bit of a fuel source moving in to that race. And I think, that's quite a good place to be. From my experience, whenever you are pushing the boundaries of what you're physically or mentally capable of, you will experience some anxiety, some nerves, and you won't really know what to expect. But that's where you will take yourself from a place where you're at and be able to kind of push through the ceiling of what you think or perceive that you are capable of. And I think that's applicable for a lot of people. Something I was thinking about, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, is talk about people who are going into their first ultramarathons, who are taking on these big events for the first time. So I think if you are going into that and you are beginning to, or you are taking on a challenge, and you're kind of umming and ahhing about whether to do it, and you do feel that kind of little bit of fear around it, that's quite natural. That is something that you will and probably should experience, because if it isn't something that is going to challenge you, that it's not going to change you. Having that unknown, having that kind of fear is something that I think you need to take on and kind of accept, and almost anticipate a little bit, especially if you're taking on something that's completely new, and something that you've never done before. The first thing I kind of want to touch on is people who are thinking of taking on their first ultramarathon. So number one is there seems to be a perception a lot of the time of an ultramarathon being vastly different from a marathon. So people who have completed the marathon distance still perceive there to be a huge gap between the two distances and what it's going to take to be able to run an ultramarathon. Especially if you're going into a 50k distance, there's only 8 kilometers difference between your marathon and your 50k. So it's actually, although at the end of a marathon you've still got to run that extra distance, there's not as big a gap as you potentially perceive. Number two is that I maintain that a marathon distance is probably one of the most physically demanding distances to run. It's long enough that that you're going to hurt at the end, but it's short enough that you can maintain an intensity that's going to stress your body a lot. As soon as you extend that distance a little bit more, and as soon as you add in things like running on trails, like adding hills, you can't maintain that same intensity unless you are someone who is a very good amateur, or they're kind of in that elite end of the race. So for most normal people, it's actually going to slow them down, because generally we'll walk up hills, run the flats, run the downhill. Because of the terrain, it's going to slow them down. And it's also because you're running on soft ground, because you're running on grass or sand or things like that, the impact isn't going to be the same. Also, the mindset is completely different. An ultra is about being able to finish and about being able to complete a big hard challenge for a lot of people. If you look at a marathon, most people are running with a perception of time or a kind of thought process around trying to push themselves to achieve a time, and they're trying to run it all. Whereas on the other side, the ultra, it's a little bit slower and it's a little bit easier. So actually what you can find a lot of the time is that when someone goes and runs an ultra, not only do they have a really good experience, but also they can tend to find it easier than running a marathon distance. So there's that element to consider, the fact that you're actually going to be moving a little bit slower, and it's not going to be as intense. Often people are perceiving ultras to be a lot harder than they are, and they're not actually giving themselves enough credit that if you run a marathon, you are more than capable to then take on a 50-kilometre distance. So don't put it off or keep pushing it back just because you perceive it as being this bigger, harder thing. Often the experience is completely different, but in a very positive way. So if you are thinking about doing it, if you run a marathon and you want to take on another challenge, I would highly recommend you enter an ultra race. Your training might need to change a little bit, but there's plenty of information out there, and there's also plenty of really good coaches that can help guide you through that process should you want to. When considering your first ultra marathon, there are kind of 3 things that I would consider. Number 1 is who is running the event, because the bigger organisers generally will put on and have the finances and the infrastructure to put on more beginner-friendly events. So when you're looking at things like Ultra Challenge and race providers like Threshold, their races are really good. They've got really good infrastructure, and there's a lot of support points throughout, which generally, as a beginner, you want to have more of. It might mean you have to pay a little bit more money, but generally it's worth it. What you can find with some of the smaller providers is there's just less available, so in terms of food, aid stations and general support throughout the course. Number 2 is elevation. Now, unless you have picked a really hilly marathon to do beforehand, generally you won't have run with as much elevation. This can make or break your first experience. So actually have a look and have an understanding of what elevation, both ascent and descent, means. From my experience, I have done a variety of different ultramarathons, and the coastal ultramarathons that have a lot of ascent and descent are very challenging. Potentially look at something a little bit flatter, something which is a little bit more rolling if you do want to have hills in there, because the coastal stuff where you're aggressively going up and aggressively going down can be very challenging. Obviously, if you want a challenge and you want to push yourself, absolutely sign up for it and go for it. But it is something to consider, especially if you live in a very flat area. So if you're looking at elevation profiles, at the hard end of things, you're looking at something like UTS 50k, which will probably have about, this is me guessing off the top of my head, but about 2,000 to 3,000 meters of elevation, but you've also got to consider the descent. whereas some of like the flatter Thames Path Ultra Challenge races are going to have minimal, if any, elevation. So they'll be a lot easier and a lot easier entry point into ultramarathons. The final consideration is terrain. Again, I'll use UTS as an example, but if you've ever been running or walking out in Snowdon, you know that some of the terrain underfoot can be quite challenging. Some of the scree and the slate is slippery, and it's quite different to anything you will run on elsewhere in the country, unless you are, in somewhere like the lakes. So if we look at like the terrain I'm on now, grassy, muddy, which actually is quite easy to run on. So if I do all of my training on here and then I take that across to Snowdon, for example, and do a UTS race, they're going to be very different. So beginning to consider what terrain you're running on for the first time is also going to be a big factor in how your race pans out and what experience you have on the day. So again, use UTS, the terrain is going to be very different and quite challenging, as opposed to if I'll use like the Thames Path as one, if you're doing like a 50k on there, it's going to mainly be probably like pavement, a little bit of road, and maybe a little bit of dirt track, but it'll all be very runnable and very easy to translate your training across from road or kind of dirt track like we've got here. So they're the kind of three things to consider. Look at who is providing the race, look at the elevation of the race, and look at the terrain. Again, I'm using the coastal path is because the coastal ultramarathons, because when I did the North Coast 110 in October, it was very different to anything I'd trained on, and as a result, it was very challenging, and I encountered problems off the back of the ascents and descents you will find in those areas. Now, this will build into the kind of hill training conversation we're going to have in a minute, but yeah, definitely something to consider when you're choosing your first ultra. So hill training is going to be a very useful tool in our arsenal, especially when approaching hilly races. So irrespective of whether that is kind of a hilly half marathon or an ultra marathon, generally it'll be really useful in ultras because, as a rule of thumb, they tend to have a little bit more elevation in them. So we're going to be working mainly on uphill efforts today, but also what I want to touch on is the importance of downhill training. I'll start with the uphill. So we're going to be working uphill today on some uphill intervals. So I will tend to use two types of uphill training, uphill intervals and also uphill tempo runs. The difference being that tempos are just longer and slightly lower in intensity. The intervals are a little bit quicker, shorter, sharper. The idea behind them is you're going to improve your strength and conditioning in your legs and your ability to work uphill. So when you come to your race day, you are more efficient at moving uphill, but you also got the strength and conditioning in your legs to be able to manage larger volumes of it. The other kind of element to this is almost practicing race day moving. And I say that because majority of people who are entering ultramarathons would be walking the uphills, which will save their legs rather than trying to run them. It will only be the people who are in the upper kind of 10% of the race that are going to be trying to run elements of this, because if you run too many hills too early on, your legs are going to suffer later as a result of this. So when you're doing like race day training, if I'm doing like a longer run, I'll walk the uphills, run the flats, run the downhills. Which nicely brings us on to a bit of downhill training. Now, as I kind of alluded to earlier, when I did that race on the North Coast 110, it wasn't the uphill that I suffered, it was the downhill, and I didn't have sufficient conditioning in my legs for the kind of downhill elements of that. And the main reason behind that was because of the aggressiveness of the ascent and the descent. So with a lot of the descending portions, it was steps. So rather than kind of running them as I would have done in the past, you were stepping down. And I'll kind of take you on to why conditioning your legs appropriately is important in a minute. And it was that built up over 45 miles that then basically caused a lot of pain and cramping in my quads and knees. My feet were covered in blisters because of my feet constantly banging the front of my shoe, which then meant that I had to massively slow down, which then basically meant that I had a long slog in front of me. If I was to do that race again, I'd approach things very differently, and the main thing behind what I would do is actually practice the downhill descending a little bit more. Now, when you're thinking about downhills, there's a couple of reasons that you'd want to be doing this. The downhill training is only going to have relevance if you're doing a race that has a lot of hills in it. So it's got a lot of ascent and I've got a lot of descent as well. So when we're training downhill, we're going to be focusing on basically 3 different things. One is technique. So we're actually going to be improving technique, which in turn is going to improve efficiency. So it's going to take less energy for us to come down and come down with a little bit more speed potentially as well. If you're going downhill and you're really tentative, you're going to be using a lot more energy to slow yourself down, whereas the more you work and improve on your technique, you'll almost be able to flow and fall down a little bit easier, which in turn is going to reduce the eccentric loading that you're going to be putting through your body. Now, when you're working uphill, you're working predominantly concentrically. When you're coming downhill, you're going to be loading a lot of your muscles, like your quads, eccentrically, which generally will mean you're doing more damage to your muscles on the way down than if you were to be going up. So that's why it's super important, one, to practice it and to get better at it, but also to begin to work on it to strengthen those muscles as you come down, and strengthen that movement as you come down a hill. Now, there's 2 elements of this. Firstly is the strength and stability element, which I think you can predominantly begin to work on in the gym. So whether that is standing, doing some balance drills, like a 4-point clock drill. You can also begin to work on things like Peterson step down, where you can start just standing on the floor, and you're going to begin to load your leg through that eccentric movement. You can then raise up the height to kind of like a step, almost like you're descending on steps as well. So that's kind of the strength and stability element you can work on. And then the final bit is just the conditioning, which again is going to be working on that kind of downhill movement. A lot of people will do reps uphill, like I'm going to do today, where I'll run up and I'll walk back down. But if you want to train downhill reps, you literally reverse it. So you run downhill and then you walk back up. Again, it depends on the race. So for the one that I'm doing next week, there's not going to be, the descents aren't going to be as aggressive. So I know I can run more of them, which is where my training will have done the majority of the downhill work, because it's a very similar terrain, and all my training over the last 6 months really, I have run or been running the downhills. So I know it's not something that I necessarily need to overtrain or train specifically. Whereas if I was to go and do a coastal ultramarathon again, it's definitely something I would look to include, and I would look to include quite an aggressive descent to replicate the stress that I put on my body as I descend over like a coastal area. And I would specifically look at doing that Peterson step down, because that is a really good way of being able to train that kind of stepping down movement in the gym. So yeah, that's some kind of ideas around you hill training up, but also how you can begin to use hill training coming back down, depending on the race you pick. The pieces and step down I would actually use probably regardless. I think it's a really good movement and it will help strengthen that area for any descending you do. And it's very easy to do in the gym, at home, and you can make it as easy or as hard, or you can scale it up or regress it as applicable to you.